Hi everyone. My inquiry project is investigating what writing is in the 21st century, which means exploring attitudes toward multimodal composition. So, what am I really talking about here when I'm asking what writing is today in 2016? Why am I interested? Why am I asking it? Well, for me, as we move further into the 21st century, it's a necessity that we reckon with the reality of composing in this century, because there are different burdens, there are different opportunities, and there are different literacies, there are different skills, and these are all things we have to address. And you can see this debate over 21st century literacy going on among scholars. And that, I think, injects an urgency to this question, which, you could arguably say is expected otherwise. But, as Cynthia and Richard say, it's now more and more becoming expected that both writing and multimodal composing be essential components of students' literacy skill sets and understandings. And I think Cynthia and Richard Self also encapsulate the feeling that I've had since I was an undergraduate, as I got deeper and deeper into my English program, and wrote more and more research papers, and really began to question the relevancy of what I was doing. And as I saw many of my peers do the same thing, Cynthia and Richard Self really, I think, encapsulate it very well. And so I want to read this quote in full. They say, unless English teachers and teachers of writing begin attending to emerging multimodal literacies in self-sponsored communication environments that exist outside the classroom, the profession will become increasingly irrelevant to students, parents, and the public. And so again, I think this question really comes back to urgency, and it's why I'm so interested. And also, I would note to pay attention to the word irrelevant, because that's going to come up well. And so I also want to give a brief definition, my own definition of multimodal composition before I move into the what scholars are saying. And so this is kind of an amalgamation of Richard and Cynthia Self's discussion of multimodality. So for me, multimodal composition means to research, organize, and present information by selecting examples, media, and multiple expressive modalities with the goal to create an end product reflective of audience expectations and needs. And I do want to note that despite the focus in this presentation on digital multimodality, because if we're discussing writing in the 21st century, digital is going to be the focal point. But multimodality is not strictly the purview of the digital age. It has a long history, going back to at least the 1960s. You can even find some scholars that would point you towards ancient Egypt, but Jody Shipka discusses some of the examples listed here of multimodal composition then. So again, there's a long history here, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're really just looking at digital multimodality. So what are the scholars saying? Well, there's definitely a lot of common themes among them, and that is frustration with the attitudes toward multimodal composition in a lot of the departments, and that frustration comes from their view that in that 21st century literacy implies being literate in ways other than traditional print text, the black words on white paper. As James Caldwell says, in the modern world, print literacy is not enough. People need to be literate in a great variety of different semiotic domains besides print. And semiotic simply refers to symbolic representation. But as you see with Hollister, many are frustrated because in the 21st century, many still cling to the familiar educational tools of the immediate past and continue to teach their rhetorical means to manipulate limited alphabetic representations of reality. And you see again, she goes on to talk a little bit more, and she uses the word irrelevant again. So this increased feeling of irrelevance pops up among several scholars. There's also some commonality in the responses by people who don't see multimodal composition or as writing. They see it as an other or even a less than. And so Jody Shipka gives an example of a comment that she received, which is, how is that college-level academic writing? How can allowing students to do that possibly prepare them for the writing they will do in their other courses? So the responses, unfortunately, there's quite a bit of commonality there too, and you'll see that a little bit later, even in the survey responses from teachers at Gardner-Webb. And I did want to read this quote in full from Richard and Cynthia Self, which is that while time work is on outside of U.S. secondary and college classrooms, inside many of these classrooms, students are producing essays that look much the same as those produced by their parents and grandparents. And this even came up in the chapter on research writing and composition pedagogies, which is the research paper becoming kind of irrelevant, to use the word again, as a genre, that it's trite now. And so it has to be looked at in different ways. One way they suggest is multimodal research projects. But again, there's this resistance here that we're seeing discussed among scholars. And here are the survey questions that I sent out to students, and feel free to pause if you'd like to read them over. And here are the questions that were sent to the teachers. Now, the results of the survey for the teachers, there's definitely some common trends. And the first one is that they found their students often have a mixed reaction to multimodal assignments. And there's comments that has to do with the lack of clear expectations, which makes them nervous. I think that's something we all, as students, can relate to. To quote them, the fuzzy elements of what is valued and not. So that's a challenge. Also, the internalization of academic writing as a genre and all its rules came up as a discussion point. But both teachers discussed student reflections as an important part of multimodal composition, to kind of address these challenges and to understand the thought processes and how students arrive at their final product. And again, like I mentioned on the slide discussing the scholarly conversation, the teachers at Gardner-Webb definitely reported a divide between their views and the English department. Though perhaps not quite as stark, but one characterization, which I thought was just spot on, was, "That's nice and fun and all, but I have to teach them how to write a literary analysis, argumentative research paper, etc." And I think that is just a great succinct way to sum up the attitudes of many people still in many of these English departments. They also commented that there is no multimodal requirement in the Gardner-Webb English department, and that I think is a clear reflection of their attitudes again, and also their priorities. However, I want to be clear that both teachers that I talked to very much valued multimodal composing. They called it an essential part of any composition course and potentially any course in any discipline. They said it's more than just real writing, so they certainly don't see it as less than. For the students, again, there's a lot of common trends. I do want to start by saying, since I just finished discussing the entirely positive attitude from the teachers, there was a broader range of attitudes among students versus teachers. Because while all the students characterized multimodal composition as interesting and rewarding, using words like amazed and liberating, some of the respondents, especially the older respondents, reported a greater sense of unease. They commented about wanting to add text to explain the images, and that this program was their first experience with multimodal composing. However, that wasn't true for the youngest respondent. His first experience was in graduate school, and he didn't report the unease. He was much more comfortable with the idea of it and with talking about it. I think it's also important to note that the students saw a lot of similarities. One said even used the word identical to their approach toward a traditional print paper and a multimodal project. So I think for people who, anybody listening, for people in departments, English department or otherwise, or for students in general who have maybe a more negative attitude, the fact that the process is quite similar should help alleviate some of those feelings of less than that come up when we discuss multimodal composition. So on to conclusions and questions. It's probably very obvious by now that a lot of my research shows multimodal composition in a favorable light, and I worry that that's part of my own bias because that's the light I view it in, and so I'm kind of naturally, even if unconsciously, gravitating towards scholars who feel the same way. So as I move further into my research, I'd really like to see if I can find some an opposing viewpoint, if only to be constructive, because you have to address the other side to really unpack an issue, I think. The other thing, and that I'm really interested to hear from all of you about, especially the ones who are high school teachers, because I saw a pretty clear trend in my survey that age as a demographic works as kind of a dividing line in attitude, or at least comfortability with multimodal composition. And since I know that no one I surveyed was younger than 22, I'm interested to hear from those teaching teenagers who have grown up even more immersed in visual media and use multimodal composition even more often and maybe even more naturally than someone who's in their early 20s. I would like to hear if they view multimodal, or if you believe they view multimodal composition as equal to a traditional print or text paper, because that's an assumption that I'm making from the admittedly kind of limited responses that I got, but it may not be bore out in reality. So I'm very interested to hear anyone's thoughts on that. Thank you for your time.